the microphone would turn on. All right, as you come into the Great Hall, sit down. This summer, we're so excited to have Dr. Bree back with us. I know you all are excited to have him back with us as well. I am trying to take something like attendance just so I know who's here and who's really interested in these lectures. So we'll pass this book around. Names are in alphabetical order. We did the best we could of who we thought were regularly attending in the past for Sunday Seminary. So if your name isn't on the list for some reason, just write it on the back page and we'll get this updated and we'll get this right. We're so glad you all are here and we're so glad Dr. Bree is with us. Enjoy.
Well, good morning. Thanks for being here. I really appreciate the time that y'all are given for us to think together about miracles. The title that I've come up with for this month is Miracles in the Bible and Beyond. And we're going to start today talking a little bit about what would we call a miracle, but also why is it so strange to talk about them today? Perhaps it's not for all of you, but I know at least for some of you, this is probably a little weird, this topic. It's a little uncomfortable even. So we're going to talk about that, about where we are today as a culture and why it's like this. And then next week, we'll move into some other topics, including more biblical studies, and then we'll move into kind of thinking about our own lives. So that's the idea for this month. But yeah, just so y'all know, I'm Brennan Breed. I teach Old Testament at Columbia Theological Seminary, and I'm on part-time staff here. My wife, Catherine Breed, is the new children's minister who's been with you for about 3 months now, and she's been having a great time getting to know you all. You all might see Freddie and Margaret Ann, my kids, running around. Feel free to, help them know what to do or how to act. That's fine. Yeah, we appreciate it. But they're sweet kids. But in any event, so I'm going to open us in prayer, and then I'll jump into my material for today. All right. Let us pray. Gracious God, God who formed the seas and the land and the sky, God who brought forth life, who shaped us and formed us in our mother's wombs, God who knows us and who is with us, God who brought Israel out of oppression across the sea with mighty acts and signs and wonders, the God who raised Jesus from the dead, the God who appeared in tongues of fire on the day of Pentecost. God, we believe, but help our unbelief. Help us to know who you are. And if you're acting in this world, if you're here, if you're with us and among us, if you're still doing things like that today, please give us eyes of faith to see, ears of faith to hear how you are at work in the world around us. Amen. All right, so we can move to the next slide. We'll be talking this month about miracles, and there are other ways or other words to talk about these things. Signs is another word that's used often in the Bible to talk about these events. But I'll focus on miracles here just to point out that the word that we use, that English word miracles, comes from the Latin word mirari, which means to wonder, like in awe, right? To be a marvelous thing, a wonderful thing, something that causes deep wonder in us. Or that comes from the Greek word thauma, or thaumaturge, you might have heard. Someone's a thaumaturgist. That means they're a miracle worker. This Greek word also means to wonder, or to cause wonder, to make something that makes us be amazed, like maybe looking at the Grand Canyon or something, right? It's filled with deep wonder and awe. Or the Hebrew word before that was used for these events is the Hebrew word niflaot. It's always in the plural, and it's a word that means wonderful things or things that cause wonder. So in all three of these liturgical or religious languages, the three languages we might see in the Bible or in the Christian, primarily Christian history, all these words signify something that God has done in the world. Let's go to the next slide. If I'm going to define miracle, I think I'd say something like an extraordinary event that is not explicable, not explainable, by ordinary means, and so kind of causes wonder. And that because we are so filled with wonder, the people who observe this event are so filled with wonder, we imagine that, and we can't help but think that there's some superhuman agency behind it. That is to say, it's not just my mind tricking me. The first thing to say about this is that I'm not saying that every single thing that someone might say is a miracle is a miracle. That is to say, I'm not walking around kind of looking around saying, well, everything is a miracle or nothing's a miracle, right? I'm wondering if there are actually things that exist and that happen in the world that are extraordinary, things that we actually can't explain. So, for example, we can think about kind of big ideas like the incarnation, right? Like the incarnation of Jesus, that God became a human being, or creation itself, God made the world. You can think of that as a miracle, perhaps, or the resurrection of Jesus. Now, what's interesting, I think, about at least my own kind of faith journey is that, like, I often put those in kind of like box A: incarnation, creation, resurrection of Jesus. Yeah, sure, those are miracles that happen. But then when it comes to like other things like faith healing, people who say they know special things without seeing them with their eye, they have special knowledge, or people talking about near-death experiences, I've always been pretty cynical. And I've been pretty suspicious. That is to say, I feel a tension within me. It's not that I don't want to believe people when they tell me things have happened. Special, amazing things have happened to them. But also, I don't know about you, but if I went walking around on the square in Marietta and started talking about all the miracles that had happened to me just out loud to anyone who happened to be passing by, I wonder how long it would be before someone called the police to come take a look at me. Just ask me a few questions, right? Or if you just show up to your place of work, if it's not a church, if you show up to your place of work or a seminary like me, I mean, if I show up to talk about miracles, people even at my seminary might say, is Brennan okay? But if you show up to your place of work and you start just talking about miracles, this miracle happened to me the other day, this miracle happened to me, people might wonder a bit about you. That is to say, instead of wondering about the wondrous event that you're saying happened, they might wonder about your brain or your mental state, right? So that is to say, what exactly is happening? Okay, so why talk about miracles? Well, other than that, I think it gets us into some interesting territory that we might kind of not talk about often, just out of being uncomfortable. The Bible mentions these things all the time. It's a huge part of the biblical faith. And you might ask yourself, if it's a huge part of the Bible, then like, why don't I see these things happen all the time? And we'll get to that next week. But the miracles in the Bible tend to talk about something. They tend to be about something. And we'll get into this more next week when we talk about the Bible. But they tend to have something to do with God's presence and God's power. Is God present? Does God actually exist? And if God does exist, does God care enough to show up here and do something about whatever's happening in the world? And on top of that, how would God act? How does God act? And so we'll talk about the particular kinds of miracles we see in the Bible and what they say about God, and what they say about how God is among people and how God actually acts. But then we have to ask that question, is our modern world like that ancient world? Are we the same, or are we actually living in a pretty different world? So our problem as modern people is this question, does God actually speak? And does God do stuff? Beyond just like, I don't know, making our hearts feel warm every now and again or something. Does God actually do something? And then how might we talk about that presence and activity of God today and not sound like we might need to go visit someone to take stock of our mental health, right? That is to say, how can we talk about these things today? All right, let's go to the next slide. So just to review our schedule, today we're going to talk about kind of an introduction to miracles, but then I'm going to talk mostly today about why it's so strange for us to talk about these things. It's a bit of a detour, but I think it'll really help us set the stage for next week and the week beyond. But I'm going to talk about something called the immanent frame. Now, you don't have to know what that is yet, but basically it's the reason why it's so strange to walk out in public and talk about God doing something in your life today, which some of you may be able to do without second thought, but I think most of us would feel a little uncomfortable just walking into, I don't know, the bank and just talking with the cashier about like what God's done in your life today. Or I saw a miracle the other day, right? So all to say, we'll talk about why this is strange. But then also, next week we'll talk about the Bible. What does the Bible say about these things, and how does the Bible characterize this in both Old Testament and New? And what does this have to do with the presence and activity of God? can we characterize God through this? And then the third week, June 18th, we'll talk about miracles and the presence and power of God in today's world. We'll try to draw a line connecting. So knowing what we know about today's world and talking about how we see God at work in the Bible, what's going on today and how can we talk about this? And then that last week, we're going to talk a little bit about our own lives and hear some stories from folks and try to think about how we as a church community might see and perceive and feel God being active among us today. So that's the basic idea. I encourage you to not skip June 25th just because it's uncomfortable sometimes to talk about ourselves. You won't be put on the spot, don't worry, but there'll be time for us to chat with each other about this. All right, next slide. So today we'll talk about miracles, which we've already started to, but then also really talk about this thing, the immanent frame. All right, next slide. So I don't know if you all have heard of this guy, Charles Taylor. He's a very important philosopher. He's a Canadian Roman Catholic. He's a committed Christian, but he's a philosopher who has thought a lot about secularity, or what does it mean today for us to live in a secular age? Now that word can mean a lot of different things. I think we can all agree today we live in a secular age, but what do we mean by that? Charles Taylor wrote this doorstop of a book, about 900 pages, all about what it means to be secular and how secularity functions today. And there's some folks who've done some good work trimming this down a bit and synthesizing it. I'll give you some of these folks next week, but just for now, just know that what I'm rehashing here is basically bits of Charles Taylor's theory, which has taken the day. That is to say, I don't know sociologists that don't think that this is really important for us to think about, or even psychologists, or folks who think about what it means to be alive today, and many folks who are thinking about churches and the health of churches, statisticians who work for the Pew Society and think about religion in America, they're all reading this guy. So what you're getting today is kind of a distilled version of his theory about secularity. So next slide. So in order to get Charles Taylor's theory of the secular, what does it mean to be alive today, thinking about God and the world, let's take a little time trip in our heads to 1500. So 1500 AD. So just before Martin Luther and the Reformation, right? If you're thinking about kind of the Western world right around 1500, if you would have asked anyone on the street, or even kings and princes and monks and bishops, you would have asked them about, are there demons? Are there angels around? Does God do miracles all the time? Everyone you meet would have said, of course, yes. And everyone would have been a person of some faith or another. There were radicals. There were people who asked questions and pushed boundaries, but pretty much everyone you met, not pretty much, everyone you met, would have agreed that there was a God. God existed, God was present, and so on. Not everyone participated in all the church rituals that people in the church wanted to, etc. But faith was just a part of the world. Everyone believed. The question was, how did they believe, etc., but they all did. And everyone believed in, again, these spirits that kind of infused the world. The world was just alive with spiritual power. People had spiritual power pass through them, right? So, for example, if someone got sick, oftentimes there was a thought, this is either the work of God or the work of an evil spirit. This was just a normal thing for people to think. So spirits are kind of everywhere in creation. And the human body is in a way kind of porous. Like God can work through you immediately, or like bad spirits can work through you. That is to say, the human body just power passes through it, spiritual power. And things too, things carry spiritual power. So if you think about the year 1500, Christians are in the West, Roman Catholic Christians, right? There was no distinction, there's no Protestantism yet. You go into a church, and of course the first thing you wanted to see was the relics, the stuff that was charged with special religious power, right? That was just everywhere. And so in the year 1500, if you and I were having a conversation about how the young kids weren't really interested in faith these days, or they weren't, conforming to the way we thought that young Christians should act and live, you know what we would do? We wouldn't try to get a new youth group going. We wouldn't try to spark a new Bible study for kids. You know what we would do? We would go try to have a fundraiser to buy one of Peter's teeth. Not kidding. Because the teeth of St. Peter were charged with special power that was efficacious. It did something in the world. Everyone believes this. No one doesn't believe this. Like today, if you go to Notre Dame, they'll say, well, we have, the crown of thorns of Jesus, but the priest will tell you it's not really the crown of thorns of Jesus. We don't know where it's a medieval invention. But, but what makes it sacred is that people have come here and prayed with it and for it and through it for hundreds of years, even 1,000 years, right? This thing is really old. It might not go back to Jesus. It doesn't go back to Jesus' time, whatever. But it's special because it's been made special by people, right? So this is the way we talk. And, actually, yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I don't think that's the crown of thorns that Jesus wore on his head that's in Notre Dame. But I also think it's a special thing people have come to, right? But in the same way, it feels cynical, doesn't it? Right? In the year 1500, there's no cynical space. No one's thinking twice about the crown of thorns. But then also, we have this idea that people can be kind of swayed easily by these spiritual forces. So I might not, if my kids were acting up in church, right now I'd be they're hungry, they're thirsty, they need to go to the bathroom, they're bored. Maybe they need a little less screen time so they can focus better. No, I mean, in the year 1500, you're thinking, is there a demon present? That's the first thing you go to. Not kidding, right? This is when Martin Luther, right, is in his monastery in Erfurt, Germany, and he starts to feel really uncomfortable about himself. What does he ascribe it to? Demonic power. Martin Luther has a fight with demons in a bathroom. He literally takes a pile of his excrement, throws it at a demon that he sees, and telling him that he's, that he can't ever succeed, he can't ever earn his salvation. So that is to say that these folk that we think of as kind of, the beginners of the Protestant tradition, are fully mired in this world, right? Okay, so let's go to the next slide. Just to give you an example of this, just to say how different this is than today. Right around the year 1500, people didn't take the Eucharist. That is to say, the Eucharist, the body of Christ, was seen by most people as the full body presence of Christ. It was a miracle. The bread was transformed into the body of Christ. And if it was transformed into the body of Christ, and you had maybe perhaps sinned between the time of your last confession and the time you take the body of Christ, you were taking judgment onto yourself. So people didn't take the Eucharist. They literally would take the Eucharist and go somewhere with it. They would take it up and put it on their fields. They would feed it to their animals to make their animals super strong and healthy. But they didn't want to have it themselves not because they didn't believe. They didn't want to take it on because they didn't want judgment on themselves. They thought it would explode their bodies if they weren't prepared for it. This terrified them. So there was a church law passed, canon law, in the Catholic Church. You have to take communion twice a year. And in order to enforce this, they started to ask people to stick out their tongues. Right? You've seen a gangster, Italian or Irish gangster movie where there's the scene where they all take communion and then someone else is killing someone in the background, right? You've seen the cross cut, you've seen these Scorsese movies or something. De Niro goes up and takes the Eucharist and he has to stick out his tongue and the priest puts it on your tongue and then you put it back in your tongue and then you have to stick your tongue back out again to show that you've taken it. You're not hiding it. You're not going to do something else with it. You're going to take the Eucharist. And the reason is because it's so powerful. Now, imagine, right, today, you come in here and you ask, why are you doing this ritual with the bread and the wine? You probably wouldn't say because the power of Jesus is going to explode me if I don't, right? That's not the way we talk about it today. It's a wonderful, it's a thing that makes me feel good, or helps me remember Jesus, or it's a religious act that can, I don't know, it can bring us all together. There's a unifying function to it, etc. It's a reminder of Jesus' presence. That's great. But just to think how different a world we live in today than Martin Luther, than John Calvin lived in, right? That is to say, this is a very, very different landscape. I remember my son Freddie one time not liking the kind of bread they used for the Eucharist because it was gluten-free or whatever. He didn't like it, and so he was like, I don't like this bread. And I was like, that's not the point. That's not why we're doing this, right? It kind of terrified me, but also I'm like, well, what else am I teaching him about this, right? That's to say, what else do we think about this thing? So, just to think about, is it even possible today to inhabit this world? And do I want to go back there? That's another question. Do I yearn for the days where, I thought that instead of maybe my child, needing a medication to get better, it was a demon and we had to exorcise it. I'd probably stick with medication myself. That is to say, I like living in this world we have today. At the same time, I do realize that we might have lost something. Maybe we kind of banished power a little bit too much from our world that we live in. So let's go to the next slide. All right, another thing, relics, right? We, at least in the Protestant church, like we don't carry around bones and say it has sacred power in it. Now, Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox and other traditions might, use relics in some way. But again, if you actually talk to priests, many of them will say, yeah, I know, it's not really, or the power is kind of like imaginary in a way, or it's the power of our community, or God can work through this thing in some very vague, indistinct way. But, we're not going to entrust St. Peter's skull to helping our youth program revive, right? The Catholic churches aren't doing this either. That is to say, we are all living in a different age. All right, let's go to the next slide. Part of what the reformers live in is this world where they start to see problems with this, right? Like Luther starts to see some of these kind of mystical forces being used by the church for cynical reasons or for profit, and he starts to see a real issue that might be emerging. So this is from the Isenheim altarpiece, which Karl Barth really loved because it's the one with John the Baptist with his long finger. This is from the back of that painting, so different part of the altarpiece. But this altarpiece was painted by this guy, Matthias Grunewald, in 1516. Today it's in Colmar, France. You can see it at the Unterlinden Museum. Beautiful place if you can ever go there. It's in the east, kind of in Alsace. But it was a monastery dedicated to St. Anthony. And St. Anthony was said at the time to have died from ergotism, which is a disease you can get from eating basically spoiled, like parasitic infested barley. So it's a painful disease, ergotism. It kind of rots your skin, and apparently there's like deep shooting pains, and apparently there's like psychological manifestations of this disease. People start to see things and have visions and hallucinations. And this was a monastery that cared for people who were suffering from this disease. And so Matthias Grunewald paints this altarpiece to this monastery of St. Anthony that takes care of people who are suffering from this disease, and he paints on this altarpiece. So while people are like taking communion there, suffering from this disease, they look up and they see St. Anthony being tormented by demons. And the demon in the lower left is suffering from ergotism. That is, people would have noticed this and said, this is a spiritual condition that I have, and it's a spiritual salvation that I'm looking for in the Eucharist. That is to say, they're not looking for doctors to heal them, right? They're looking for a prayer remedy. And this is some of the stuff that Martin Luther is looking at and saying, I don't know about that. I don't know if we can attribute all of this stuff to demons. I don't know, and he himself is thinking demons are fully real, but he's also thinking, I don't know if we can attribute the salvation to like St. Anthony's knuckle bone that we've got in the church that is working through us and the power is working through us, right? He's starting to ask questions about this world. And this world, we would call the enchanted world. Enchanted because there's just power, spiritual power everywhere that just goes through the universe. So this enchanted world starts to crumble or crack. All right, let's go to the next slide. Just to show you how unusual it was for someone to think differently, if you go to Venice today, you can see a statue of Paolo Sarpi, who died in 1623. He was so dangerous to the Catholic Church that he was actually attempted, there were several attempted assassinations, one in which there were people who stabbed him some 20 times, but he lived. That was in the 1580s, and he ended up dying in 1623. But if you go to Venice and see his statue, you can see it says in Italian on it, but it says the only unbeliever of his generation. Imagine living in a world in 1623 when someone who didn't believe in God was so remarkable that you had to build a statue to them. And he was the only person you knew like that. And by the way, he believed in God. He just asked a lot of questions about the Roman Catholic Church. That is to say, he wasn't a pure atheist in our sense. He just didn't believe in the way that everyone else believed in God, and that was enough to get him a statue. Wow, this guy was really weird. And the Pope tried to kill him, like sent assassins after him, right? So the only unbeliever of his generation. Imagine if you built a statue for every unbeliever in Marietta today. Right, we wouldn't be able to move anywhere, right? And it's not a problem. That's to say, like, we shouldn't be like angry at these folks or upset at these folks. We just live in a very, very different world. So how did this change? How did we get here? Let's go to the next slide. This is just to say, just this enchanted world. You know, like I think of like, you know, just a like kind of mystical, like, you know, we still have these moments in our world today where we might feel the enchanted world. Like in a graveyard at night when there's mist and, you know, you start to get that little creepy feeling. Like we still all kind of believe this a little bit, but just not most of the time. I'll get back to that. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So today, fast forward, you know, 523 years, right? From 1500, right? That is to say, we now live in what we might call a secular world. This can mean a few different things, but the way I'm going to talk about it is the way that's derived from Charles Taylor, and it means basically three things, and I'll kind of bring these up for you. The first is that we live in a world where there's a massive distinction between public and private. Okay, in the enchanted world, the big distinction is between sacred things and profane things. And profane does not mean bad. Profane means normal. So this binder, this like folder, is profane. It's not been blessed with holy water. It's not an object used inside a church. It's my personal thing. I take it home. It's profane. It's not holy or sacred. It's not been set aside for special use in a sacred space. So there are sacred things like relics that are charged with special sacred power, and then there's profane things or normal things like the rake I use at home to rake up the dirt in my driveway, or whatever. The leaves, when they fall, right? That is to say, this sacred profane thing has changed. Like now, when you go out and talk about religion, you're not talking about a distinction between sacred things and profane things, right? We don't treat this altar very differently from every other, I have coffee here, sorry if that's, this is just a normal space, right? We can use this for VBS, and we can use this for food distribution, and we can use it to worship God. Instead of a sacred profane divide, now we have a public-private divide. There are public things and there are private things. And private things are things we don't talk about in public, like religion, right? So here's, things we don't talk about, politics. Well, now we all do talk about politics in public, but you have to be careful, right? But then religion, right? You're not supposed to talk about religion at a dinner, like a work dinner where you're meeting new people, business deal dinner. You don't bring, hey, what church do you go to, right? That's weird now. You don't do that, right? It's a private thing. Or money, how much you make, right? Okay, hang on a second. Yeah, we don't know each other that well yet, right? Or Bruno. We don't talk about Bruno, right? Everyone who has a kid, who's under the age of 10 probably knows this song too much now. We don't talk about Bruno from the movie, this Enchanted, what is it called? Encanto, yeah, the Enchanted House movie, yeah, or Magic House movie as my niece calls it. But so, in any event, all to say this public-private divide, right, this idea, and so if there are, if you start talking about your private things in very public spaces, like if someone is running for mayor of Marietta and they just won't shut up about all of their opinions about religion, very specific opinions about religion. Let's say they're Eastern Orthodox and they keep telling you how services are supposed to run. Like the mayor comes in here, he's like, no, you're supposed to baptize people only when they have reached a certain age. And you'd be like, no, that's not your job, right? Not everyone is supposed to worship the same way. Well, in the year 1500, everyone had to worship the same way in a geographic area. If you wanted to do it different, you had to leave. You didn't have a choice in this, right? But today, we've made this public-private divide, so this is a private thing we're doing here. Now people are welcome to it if they want to, but they can't tell us how to do it here, right? We don't have to all do it the same way, and this is part of living in this secular world where we have these divisions, where you're allowed to go to that church if you want to do it that way, this church if you want to do it this way. All right, next slide. One other thing about the secular world is the rise of science and the study of nature as nature. And by the way, this doesn't happen, as I'll explain in a minute, without the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation is really what makes this possible. The Protestant reformers, like Martin Luther, start to say, hey, let's think critically about some of these stories about miracles and how the world works. And they're the ones that create this kind of safe space for science to do its thing. And by the way, I should say, I love science. I love science. I love reading about cosmology and the theories about the origins of the universe and when did the laws of gravity form and what nanosecond in time did this happen, and thinking about the miracles of the mysteries of the human body. How does human evolution work? I believe that evolution explains how humans evolve as a species, right? That I love science, love it. At the same time, I do believe that the God of the Bible is real and still works in our lives. How do I do that? We'll get to that later. But all to say that this is an unusual position now, right? That there seems to be this kind of divide in a way between you got to either believe in Darwin or you believe in the Bible. And we kind of feel this tension for us. And because science in many ways is asking us to explain things by data, by repeatable data. That is to say, what can you repeat as an experiment over and over and over again and show that it happens again and again and again in the same exact way? That's science. So anything that God does special in the world, by definition out of bounds, right? God's breaking the laws of nature through miracles. Well, then we can't study that. Not possible. And also like just not allowable within our contextual current worldview, right? So this is one of the issues. We live in this world where, I mean, objective science is the measure of whether or not something is kind of worth talking about as a country, let's say, right? So next slide. Just to give you an example of this, I'm sure that on May 26, 2021, all of you were having a really tough day. All of you have been concerned for weeks, maybe months, about something. You were asking questions. You were probably knocking down your pastor's doors. I know that Cassie and Joe were getting phone calls, requests for Zoom conversations. I mean, I know your schools were probably all very concerned. All the kids, the parents are worried, do I send our kids to school this day? Because, as you know, the super blood moon happened, right? I mean, you were wondering, like, is this an auspicious date for a marriage? Or, like, should I go outside today? Or should I quit my job and leave? Or, right, is this a sign for me, right? No, okay, just to say, like in 1500, a super blood moon happens and everyone freaks out. This is a moment of extreme pastoral care for all priests across all of Europe, right? And even today in other parts of the world, right? These things matter because the God or the gods are speaking to you through these events. Like, I studied the ancient world, and in the ancient world, this is a massive event. If there's an eclipse in ancient Mesopotamia, if there's a massive event involving the moon showing up twice as big as normal in red, they assume that this is a portent, an omen of an evil event. And they would take someone, they would assume that it meant the king was going to die. So they would take someone, they would dress them up to look like the king. They would sew the name of the king onto that garment. They would name this person and anoint them with oil and call them the name of the king, and then they would execute this person so that the king could live, right? The king died. Now they'd hide the king, like the real king, in some chamber, take off his kingly clothes and dress him up like a peasant so that the gods couldn't tell who was who, and then they would offer as a sacrifice this substitute king, and that would allow the king to continue to live. So that doesn't happen today, right? You weren't imagining you had to do something like this on the super blood moon, right? And just to point out that we might say to ourselves, no, I'm not a scientist at heart. I'm a full-blooded believer in Jesus. Well, just to say, science has changed us. All of us live in this world, even no matter what we say, right? And you can go find, Oral Roberts himself, believed gravity existed. Like Isaac Newton was a full-blooded believer in Jesus, and yet spent his life figuring out calculus and gravity, right? That is to say, we live in a world of science now, whether we like it or not. And actually, I think we all really rather like it. None of us refuse to drive in cars because it's a modern invention, right? I'm going to walk to Kentucky to visit my family. No, we're not going to do that, right? Okay, so let's go to the next slide. All right, so as I said earlier, one of the main causes, perhaps the main cause of the world we live in today is actually the Protestant Reformation. And I should be the first person to say, I don't want to go back behind it. I don't want to go back to the enchanted world because I actually like a lot of our modern conveniences and because I am interested in science and I think it's great and it helps us. I'd rather drive in a car than walk 500 miles to visit family. So what do I do with this, though? That's to say, when Martin Luther nails those 95 Theses to the door, everyone pretty much believes there's demons everywhere, even he does, but he's starting to ask questions, and he starts to ask rational questions about the church. Those 95 Theses are theses where he's trying to say the church isn't right about all these things. And this is actually a radical thing to say. People have been burned at the stake for this before. Luther manages to survive and gets his word out, and lots of people start to ask questions. Now, he's not the first. Jan Hus is before him in the Czech Republic. John Wycliffe is before him in England. But people have been trying to ask these questions for centuries, and his finally catches. And there are some German kings that like him and protect him, so he ends up living. So let's go to the next slide. So one of the things that Luther is really critical about is miracle stories. And this is one of the things that binds together some of the early Protestant movements. They're critical, not of all stories of the Bible, of Jesus healing people, whatever. They're critical of these stories that have been used in the Catholic Church from their perspective, cynically for the church to try to use people for money, right? Indulgences, right? The miracle of having your sins saved, or like getting years knocked off of your time in purgatory by if you give money. So Luther and then later Calvin, right? They're very critical of relics, of the sale of relics. The church will sell the tooth of St. Peter for a lot of money because it has lots of spiritual power, right? So these are seen as problems by these reformers. And they're also actually seen as problems within the Catholic Church itself. The Counter-Reformation is the movement within the Catholic Church to try to address some of these abuses and yet retain Catholic theology. So in the Catholic Church today, there are much different responses to and uses of miracle stories and relics than there were in Luther's time. Just to say, don't go up to your Catholic friend and say, we got you. No, the Catholic Church has addressed this. They worked on it very hard. But the Protestant movement, in many ways, was the first to be rational. Try to think rationally about these miracle stories. And let's go to the next slide here. They really are, in many ways, the first rationalists to try to use objective thought and to say, these things don't end up sounding right to us. We're going to assume naturalism by default. Luther starts to do this, Calvin does this. We're going to assume naturalism by default. We're going to assume that the Eucharist isn't actually an extra special miracle of Jesus' presence unless we can prove that. And it's just a piece of bread, right? So let's just treat it as a piece of bread. It's not a miracle, it's just a memory of a feast, etc., right? So this is to say that this world we live in now is in many ways a result of this approach, which I don't deny that it was a good thing to ask questions about these miracle stories and about St. Peter's tooth and things. It's important to ask those questions. But if we use only naturalism as our only default, I wonder if we might be cutting some things out of the story. All right, next slide. So there's a debate that evolves within the Reformed Church. It continues and spreads out into all of Protestantism, and today you can even find some people who care. This church, I'm sure we don't use these terms or think about this, but you can find some people in Marietta that this is a big debate for them, and that is to say continuationism versus cessationism. And the idea is, some of the early reformers say that God's miracles stopped at the end of the apostolic age. When the last apostle dies, whoever that was, John or something, the last apostle dies, then those gifts are gone. You can't do miracle healings anymore. You're not going to see visions. You're not going to hear stuff from God, God's audible voice. That stuff is dead. What we have now is the Word of God, the Bible, and the Holy Spirit doing things like making us feel this way or that slightly, but it's nothing crazy, nothing out of the ordinary. The ordinary world is the only world now. Continuationism is this opposite view where God is still doing these miracles. Now, you'll find this often in, say, Pentecostal churches, which focus on things like speaking in tongues, faith healings, and things like this. And I just have to admit, I might be teaching a class on miracles, and I might be trying to open our perspectives a little bit. At the same time, I get real uncomfortable when I'm in some of those spaces where there's a pressure on demanding God to do miracles for us in our presence, and perhaps people being persuaded to see or do things that maybe they aren't actually experiencing one without their own effort. So just to say, I feel this tension as well. Okay, let's go to the next slide. And the other thing too is that just to note that in terms of the Bible, right, we read these stories of Jesus healing and things like this, and in many ways, science has beaten the Bible. I mean, like if you just kind of talk to people in churches, how does Jesus know this stuff? They might be like, well, he's really good at reading people's body language. Or how does Jesus heal these people? Well, what they call demons in the ancient world, those are actually like psychiatric malfunctions of the brain. And, Jesus was just doing talk therapy with them. And, they just responded well to it, like pretty much immediately. But you can do the same thing in a clinical setting. That is, you just listen to someone tell their story. The Gerasene demoniac tells his story, and Jesus listens and says, "You're wonderful, God loves you." And that's enough, right? That can heal him. Now, I believe in talk therapy. That is, I think that this is a good thing, and people are healed through it. At the same time, I wonder if that's what Jesus was doing. I don't know. But if you talk to most Christians in America, I think, unless they're in a Pentecostal church or something like that, I think most of them would kind of reduce things to naturalistic explanations. Or the crossing of the Red Sea. It was a wind that went all night and just kind of moved the water, right? The manna in the wilderness, oh, it was like a flaky substance that was like the poop of a particular kind of caterpillar or something. There's all kinds of explanations for these things. And just to know that those aren't coming from a lack of faith. Those are coming from our own tradition. It's the production of our own tradition, our naturalistic way of reading text and thinking about God. Okay, next slide. So this reaches like a peak, I would say, in Rudolf Bultmann, who's a wonderful New Testament scholar. He was a German academic who was anti-Nazi, right? He's a good guy. He's a faithful Christian in many ways, but at the same time, he believed we live in a very different world from the first century. We live in such a different world from Jesus' day that we can't really understand it very well. So his method of interpreting the Bible is what he calls demythologization, taking away the mythology. That the Jesus story to us is a myth because myths kind of tell this ancient past with like miraculous things happening, and we don't live in that world. When Bultmann walked into the classroom for his students, he would turn the lights on and off a few times. And he would say, what would they have called this in Jesus' day? That's a miracle. But we know it's electricity. And here's a quote from one of his works. We cannot use electric lights and radios and, in the event of illness, avail ourselves of modern medical and clinical means, and at the same time believe in the spirit and wonder world of the New Testament. For him, this is an either or, a one or the other. We can't do both. All right, let's go to the next slide. This world, Charles Taylor gives a name to it, this world we live in now. He calls it the immanent frame. Okay, so this is a distinction between transcendent and immanent. Transcendent really means something that goes beyond this world, supernatural. God is one way to talk about this, or spirits that don't belong in our world exactly, right? Things you can't see with your eyes of your eyes, eyes of your head, but you can see with eyes of faith maybe, right? That is to say, things that are not reducible to the natural world. That's the transcendent world. And the immanent world is this stuff right here that you can weigh, you can see, you can measure, you can put it into a spectrometer, right? You can, you can explain it 100% using your faculties of sight, smell, touch, taste. That's the immanent world that we live in right now. And what Charles Taylor says is we live in this world where, whether we like it or not, we're asked in almost all of our encounters with people to use the immanent frame. That is to take almost like a frame, like a picture frame, and just put it on things like our faith, our church, the Bible, and to try to see it and talk about it only through what you can what you can see, touch, taste, and smell. That is to say, God is a special feeling you have. Great. Okay, God is a feeling. Okay, so God is kind of maybe reducible in some ways to like chemicals that are going on in your brain and stuff like that. We can figure that out. But that is to say, that's God. If you want to talk about God as something that's actually moving in this room that's like not reducible to the physical elements of this space, that's a little weird, and it starts to get kind of creepy for people. That is to say, not all of us, not all the time, but generally, this is the expectation. And if politicians, let's say, start to get a little too spiritual, they can talk about God in kind of vague moral terms. There's another scholar who uses the frame moralistic therapeutic deism. This is the kind of God that most of us can talk about in public today. Deism, this means a God that created the world and then kind of stepped away, isn't active in the world doing miracles and showing up and saying things, audibly hearing or seeing, having visions. No. Deism is a God who set the world to work like a clock and then just kind of backed away a little bit, right? This is the God the founders of our country in most part, many of them believed in, right? That is to say, we look at the writings of Thomas Jefferson, we can see he's thinking about this kind of clockmaker God who then steps away and lets it run. It's up to us then to run the world. And moralistic and therapeutic. Moralistic means God more or less kind of wants us to be good, but it's a vague kind of goodness. And then therapeutic. God is primarily interested in your feelings and how you feel, and God is there for chicken soup for the soul. God wants me to feel good feelings and be supported and loved and know that I'm loved, and that's primarily how religion works. So vague kind of moralism, a vague kind of feeling-based religion. And then deism. You can't talk too much about this God showing up in person or it gets a little uncomfortable. This moralistic therapeutic deism is the God of the immanent frame. And it's a God that's reducible to the things of this world. And our brains really and our emotions. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So as you might think, this world also, the secular world, the first big one, this kind of public-private distinction, but then also this is now a world of freedom and choice. That you can choose. You can choose what church to go to in Marietta. You're not forced to go to any of these. You can go to the Baptist church, you can go to the Lutheran church, you can go to a mosque, you can go to the synagogue, you can go to lots of different places. You can go to nowhere if you want, right? This is a world that's it's up to you to choose. And actually part of your identity is kind of figuring out for you what's right. And this world, I don't want to go back to a world where everyone's forced to go to the same local church under punishment of execution, which is how it used to be, right? Like you couldn't rebel too much or you get stabbed like Paolo Scarpi that we saw, right? No, I don't want to go back there. I want this world where we can actually allow our neighbors to choose what they want to do in terms of faith, and like we're not going to hurt them for it. At the same time, just we need to recognize that this world creates a different kind of environment for us to talk about God and about our faith with our neighbors. All right, next slide. And one last thing that Taylor talks about that's really important, I think, is for us to recognize that that immanent frame has its cracks. Taylor is at pains to show that we all kind of assume the immanent frame, but we also all really don't fully believe it. And this is true for everyone. There are no pure believers, Taylor says. Everyone has their doubts. In the year 1500, it'd be really hard to find someone who had real doubts about God existing. They might have doubts about what the church said about this or that. They might have doubts about whether or not Jesus does everything that people say he does, etc. That's fully acceptable. But whether or not God exists or something, whether or not God does stuff in the world, that just wasn't a question. It wasn't up for debate. No one thought this. People who were atheists just didn't believe what you thought. But today, not believing is kind of the default option. That is to say, going to church is kind of the strange thing now, right? If you're like really involved in your church, I mean, depends on where we are geographically, it depends on our age cohorts. But for me, I live in Decatur, and I hang out with people who are, in our 40s, and most of my friends think it's a little strange that I'm involved in this stuff, right? But all to say that they don't fully believe in their own unbelief either. It goes both ways. Whereas I admit fully that I have my doubts, and that I have my moments of extreme doubt. But I'm a Christian because I keep swinging back to faith. More often than not, I'm in faith. But I do feel this tug towards unbelief. And Taylor's point is it goes the other way too. My friends that call themselves atheists sometimes come and ask if they can buy a beer and talk to me about a strange experience they had. Or they come talk to me about, I had one friend come and buy me a beer, and he's a scientist and he's an atheist, and he sat down and told me about how he thought he had a conversation with his dead grandparent. It's a pretty strange conversation to have, and he said, I don't know what to do with this. That is to say, all belief is fragile, even unbelief is fragile. We're all swinging a bit in the wind. And that's what happens when these structures of faith and structures of science, whatever, start to kind of show their cracks. It's an interesting time for us to be in. And maybe an interesting time for us to think about how God is active and present and how we speak about it in this world of fragile faith. All right, next slide. I just got a couple more things. This is, my little image for kind of how I feel sometimes, like I don't know most things, but every once in a while I feel like there's this little vein of light kind of coming in. This is maybe a little image for faith in the immanent frame. All right, next slide. This is, I remember seeing this painting in Paris in Saint-Sulpice church and just being like, wow, just wrestling an angel. Do any of us feel like this anymore? Just to get that juxtaposition of the year, 1500 and today. I want to walk out and wrestle an angel today. If you said that and just walk out in the square and start talking about wrestling an angel, someone's going to call social services on you. All right, next slide. So one thing to talk about is selective attention. Y'all ever see this thing, the gorilla skit? There's a little video, and it shows people passing a basketball back and forth. And they say, on the frame, how many times does the basketball get passed? So you're counting how many times the team passes the basketball. And this is a freeze frame from that video, but a gorilla, a person in a gorilla suit, walks in and hits their chest and then walks out. No one sees this. They at the end of the video, they replay it. I thought everyone would know it, but if you don't know it, you can just Google selective attention, and there's all kinds of videos about this. But you will not notice the gorilla unless I've told you about it. Now you know. But there's other selective attention tests that will blow your mind. If you're asked to focus on something, you will miss bizarre things. Nobody sees the gorilla in this video until they're told about it. They go back, they watch it again, they're like, I missed a gorilla walking through and beating their chest and then walking right out of the frame. And they just walk slowly all the way through. It's amazing. But this idea of selective attention is getting a lot of attention, unselective attention, by cognitive psychologists today and so on, researchers who are studying focus and attention and how it works in humans. By the way, the attention economy, our attentions are the #1 product of our economy today, right, with our phones and so on. So this is a big, big area of research. And selective attention shows us that if we focus on things, or if we don't think things are possible or real, we don't notice them. They just go right by us. Hey, let's go to the next slide. There's a guy, Arthur Ellison. He was a British electrical engineer, actually, but he liked to do this experiment using electricity and magnetism, electromagnetism. And he would be giving a lecture, and he would call 6 people down to the front, and he had this flower pot on a table at the front of and he would have the 6 people stand in front of it, and using electromagnetism, he would make it levitate, actually levitate 6 inches off the table, which is, that's crazy, right? If I made the pulpit, rise 6 feet above the ground right now, you might think this is a strange event, right? One of the 6 people, and they were being watched by everyone else, and they were standing there, so like not everyone can see this. That's to say, the people in the audience have to take the word of the people who are looking at it. Only one of the 6, in general, when he did this experiment, only one of the 6 people would admit or would acknowledge that they saw this event. They would turn around and tell the people in the audience, what did you see? Nothing. One person, generally, every time says, I saw the thing levitate. Now, is that selective attention? They don't even see it because they don't believe it can happen? Or is it they feel strange about saying it? Now, let's go to the next slide. There's another experiment. This was done in 1993 in Sweden, when they had 50 people who had recently been bereaved, and they asked them a lot of questions. One of the questions they asked them was, have you had an extra normal or superordinary experience of visitation with your bereaved loved one after their death? One person out of the 50 says yes. And that person is, like they call themselves a spiritualist, right? They're like a spiritual faith healer. Okay, so no one says yes, basically. Then they have the scientists meet with the people individually and tell them, hey, just so you know, a lot of people report that they have had these experiences, and it's okay, and it doesn't mean you're sick. They ask them that question again, and more than half say, yes, I've had an experience like this. All it took was for someone to say, it's okay to say this. And more than half report this strange experience. So maybe part of this is that selective attention effect. We just don't even see it because we don't even think we can see it. But then part of it might also be there's the awkward silence. Is it okay to tell people about this? I've had conversations with folks who say they've seen miraculous things. Miraculous things have happened in their own lives. And I ask them, have you told your pastor about this? And they say no. I don't know that I've met a lot of people who say yes, that they've even told their pastor. And you ask why, and they say, because they think I'm crazy. All right, next slide. So this, sorry, it's a little out of sync, but the yes is the left column, no is the middle, don't know is the right. But just to say, this has been changing a lot in American culture. The ability to say, yes, I've had a religious or mystical experience. And my guess is if you talk to them, you might even get more people to say yes. But in 1962, only 22% of people in America said, yes, I've had a religious experience or a mystical experience. And that number now is 49% of people who would tell a completely anonymous researcher on the telephone, yes, I've had a mystical experience. My guess is there are a lot of people who think, I'm not going to say this over the telephone to someone I don't know. But that is to say, 49% of people say, yeah, sure, And notice that the don't knows have gotten even bigger. So this is to say, we live in a secular age where people don't believe in God, but we got way more people that'll say they've seen a miracle. Double from 1962. All right, next slide. And just one last thing to point out is there's even like a website that this guy developed for scientists who are researchers, clinical researchers in medicine and so on, to be able to just archive their transcendent supernatural experiences because they have to do this anonymously. It's an anonymous website where they submit their reports. Now, of course, it's an actual edited journal. People submit their names and their positions, but they're not published, so that the reviewers know where these people are. They can validate whether or not they're real people. They can call them and talk to them about their experience. But this is a place where people can safely talk about this stuff. It's something happened to me, and I can't explain it. Next slide. This is the very last thing to say. This is a guy, Scott Haig, who actually published in Time a report, and I'll end with this. So Scott Haig is a clinical professor of orthopedic surgery at Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons, and he published this in Time magazine in 2005. This is about David. An anonymous name for a patient of his. He says, David's head was literally stuffed with lung cancer. I was called in to take care of his hip and pelvic bones broken by growing metastases. His seeming nonchalance about the pain of the surgery was clearly out of concern for his beautiful young family, his wife Carol, a nurse, his 3 kids who were there every night. He couldn't keep up the carefree charade over the next couple of weeks, though. His speech slurred, he became incoherent, he stopped speaking, then moving. I dreaded making the rounds on a patient for whom there was no good news, no good plan. When his doctors rescanned his head, there was barely any brain left. The cerebral machine that talked and wondered, winked and sang, that machine that remembered jokes and birthdays, that was almost all gone, replaced by lumps of haphazardly growing gray stuff, his lungs. Gone with that machine seemed David as well. No expression, no response to anything we did for him. He was just not there. It was particularly bad in the room that Friday when I made the evening rounds. His family was there, sad, crying faces on all of them. I fussed with the hip a bit. His respirations had become agonal, that gulping kind of breathing movement that precedes death. I knew Carol had seen this, his wife, and she knew what it meant. I said something inane. I slid out the door fast. I looked at the papers in my hand. I was striding for the corridor. But Carol came after me, needing to catch me away from her kids. Her eyes were rimmed with red. She asked me where her husband was. He's just not there. I noticed the cross around her neck. I said, I don't know where he is now, but I'm pretty sure I know where he's going. She wanted to believe me. Saturday morning, the sun poured in as I checked the room. The bed was at chest height, made up and empty, with fresh, clean sheets over the vinyl mattress. And as I turned to leave, I was blocked by a nurse, an older Irish lady with a doleful look on her face. She had taken care of David last night. He woke up, doctor, just after you left, and he said goodbye to them all. Just like I'm talking to you right here, like a miracle. He talked to them, he patted them, he smiled. It was about 5 minutes. And then he went out again, and he passed. My eyebrows went up. He didn't have a brain. 2 weeks later, I saw Carol in the lobby. It was busy, it was public, but before the last God bless you, I couldn't help but asking, Carol, did he? Oh, she knew my question. The wide, knowing smile, she nodded and she said, he sure did. And I believed her. But it wasn't David's brain that woke him up to say goodbye that Friday. His brain had been destroyed. Tumor metastases don't simply occupy space and press on things, leaving a whole brain just squished. The metastases actually replace the brain tissue. Where the gray stuff grows, the brain just isn't there. What woke my patient that Friday wasn't simply his mind, forcing its way through a broken brain, a father's final act to comfort his family. The mind is a uniquely personal domain of thought, dreams, countless other things like will, faith, and hope. These fine things are as real as rocks and water, but like the mind, weightless and invisible, maybe even timeless. Material science shies away from such things as the mind, calling them epiphenomena, programs running on a computer, tunes on a piano. This understanding can't be ignored. Not too much seems to get done on earth without a physical brain. But I know that this understanding isn't complete either, because I saw David. I see the mind have its way all the time when physical realities challenge it. And a patient stubbornly working to rehab after surgery, and a child practicing an instrument struggling to create a mind or will clearly separate, hovers above that machinery of the brain, forcing it toward a goal. It's wonderful to see. There's a power over the mere clumps of particles that, however petty, will eventually clump and vanish. He says, neuroscience, neuroanatomy, neuropharmacology are concerned with myriad complex, amazing things, but none of these disciplines seem to find the mind. It's smaller than all this somehow, but bigger than the cells or molecules. We really should have bumped into it somewhere on the way down, but we haven't. Many think the mind is only there, existing somehow in the physical relationship of the brain's elements. The physical, say these materialists, is all there is. I fix bones with hardware. As physical as this might be, I can't be just a materialist. I can't ignore the internal evidence of my own mind. It would be hypocritical. And worse, it would be cowardly to ignore these occasional appearances of the spirits of others, of minds uncloaked in naked virtue like David's goodbye. And that's all he wrote. He doesn't tell us how to exactly understand this, but it happened. And how did this happen when it was physically impossible? So, next slide. I'll end with this. We'll come back and start talking about this next week. I'll leave you with 2 questions just to ponder this week. The first, how can we perceive the presence and activity of God in a disenchanted age like we live in today? And the second one, how can we talk, not just perceive, how do we see God at work today in our disenchanted age without going back to an enchanted world or pretending like we don't live here? But how do we talk about it with each other, with others? All right, I'll end there. I know I talked a lot this week, sorry. We'll get more to talking together as a group later. But this next week we'll talk about the Bible. I'll see you all then. Peace.